This lecture is on cognitive learning. This lecture is given on Tuesday, January 12th, and will cover all sorts of connections that cognition has on the learning process. We start with observational learning. One of the first people to come up with an observational learning kind of idea was a researcher at Stanford named Albert Bandura. What he did was he had children in a playroom that he designed, which was essentially just a lab, and he had a assistant beat an inflatable doll that you see here in the picture with a mallet. She punched it, she kicked it, and then she put the kid. Then they put the kids in this room, and what they found is that those kids who had witnessed the assistant punching and kicking were more likely to beat the Bobo doll, kick it, use the phrases that she used against it, and even went beyond what she did and simulated other violent acts against this doll. What Bandura found was that people, and especially children, learn through observing and learn through watching other people. And this really caused him to demonstrate how people learn by viewing and learn by watching. And this allowed him to develop his theories about observational learning even further. In fact, some children will even go beyond and over imitate. And what that means is that not only will they imitate the actions of adults and other people around them that are relevant, they'll also imitate those actions that are irrelevant too. In an experiment in Australia, they had people stroke a glass with their finger before they took a sip. And what they found is 2 to 5 year olds who were watching them would also did this as well, even though that obviously has no relevance on drinking a glass of water. What Bandura found is that when people watch others, they learn through modeling. Now, some modeling is what we would call pro-social modeling, meaning that by watching someone else do a behavior that is socially acceptable and socially generous and socially helpful, those people will learn to do those actions as well. Not only will they learn how to do those actions, they'll learn when to do those actions. But on the flip side, we can also learn through modeling in an antisocial fashion, meaning that this goes against social connections that people have. So things like fighting, aggressiveness, violence, aggressive language would all be considered antisocial modeling because it creates gaps between the connections between individuals. Why do we learn and why do we act through observation? Well, it's because we have special neurons in our brain called mirror neurons. These mirror neurons activate whenever we watch somebody do some sort of behavior. And then when we do that behavior, those neurons activate as well. By looking at things like fMRIs, we're able to tell that there's the activity in the brain that exists when we watch someone do something also exists when we perform that action. Additionally, we also use mirror neurons to imitate people's emotional state. Not only when we were put in similar situations as some people, what we might do is mirror how they feel and how they respond and react. And then when we're in that situation, we respond and react the same way. This is some of the precursors of how mirror neurons create empathy, where we can put ourselves in other people's perspectives and feel what they're feeling. The effect of observational learning on violence, and certainly observational learning within the media, has an impact on behavior. Now, what we found is that violent media like video games and movies and TV don't necessarily cause a person and prove that a person will commit violent actions later on. However, it does limit their sensitivity and their inhibitions towards violence. The violence viewing effect says that when we watch someone commit violence and then that person doesn't get repercussions like consequences, then that person becomes attractive, and that the problem solving technique of using violence becomes attractive to the viewer and makes it more, and it changes our opinions, and we learn different opinions about those violent actions because we see that there are no consequences. Uh, Along with that, of course, kids are certainly prevalent to imitating using mirror neurons the violent actions that they see in TV shows like karate kicking around the house. And additionally, finally, violence in media will also desensitize us to those violent things where we don't feel as strongly about them, and it doesn't bother us as much. And so it makes it more likely that we feel less bad to commit violent actions ourselves. Stress affects us in a variety of different ways, and we need to figure out how to deal with the stress. And so, this process of figuring out how to deal with the stress is a process of learning. We call this coping. We can learn to address stress in one of two ways. We can learn to address it through problem focused coping, where we seek to eliminate the stressor, or deal with the stressor, which is basically meeting the problem head on. But we also may cope through making ourselves feel better. This means that we may not actually address the problem, but we'll do something like going out with friends or things like that that makes us feel better instead. Whenever someone experiences an uncontrollable event that has negative effects on them, uh, it can cause them to perceive that they are not in control of their lives. Now, within that one event, they may not be in control. But if events like that happen over and over and over again, what a person may experience is the perception that they're not in control of anything. And even when they get into events or situations where they should have control, they feel like they don't. And this generates what we would call learned helplessness, where we just learn that we can't deal with any sort of bad thing that happens to us, even if those bad things are in fact dealable. Now, the effects of helplessness is that it makes us more sick. It affects our immune system, and the increased amount of stress that we get for feeling helplessness causes internal inflammation, which, of course, in turn causes our immune system to address that inflammation and not to address the illness or injury that we might be experiencing. Whenever we talk about things like control, we need to perceive how we deal with the control. Some people have what's called a certain perception called an internal locus of control. Those people believe that we control our own fate. Uh, and so our actions determine what's going to happen to us. Yet others believe that it's outside forces, fate, that affects us. And those people have what's called an external locus of control, that says things beyond our personal control are what's going to determine our fate. And for people who have external locus of control, what they found is that there are higher levels of anxiety and depression, higher levels of things like PTSD, and other mental health things, because we just feel like we can't deal with the problems because the problems are something that is not, that's outside of us. It's something that we can't deal with in general anyway. Self-control is incredibly important. But self-control is kind of like a muscle. It's easy to develop bad habits and to be impulsive, and it's hard to reverse those bad habits. Yet if we practice day after day after day, what we're going to find is our ability to reject the impulse or ignore the impulse will become stronger and stronger and stronger. However, using that self-control muscle can, like any sort of muscle, can get used up. And so if we develop a lot of self-control in one situation, it may make us have less control in other situations. There was a really famous experiment in which hungry people spent their willpower resisting the temptation to eat chocolate chip cookies, but then after that, they quit a really simple task that was kind of tedious, because They just didn't have that self-control to keep going later on. When we talk about cognition's influence on learning itself, we can look at a few different things. With classical conditioning, what we find is that when we create an association, that affects a certain attitude that we might have towards things. And what we find is that it creates a sense of expectation. If an animal hears a tone uh, that's followed by a light, and then gets a shock, then even though the light was the precursor to the shock, the tone may cause that animal to be scared. And that's because it develops the expectation of what's going to come next based on that association that they developed. Some learning, however, just pops out of thin air. Insight learning causes us to basically just come up with a solution, a creative, a novel solution, and then we learn that that's a potential solution in future similar instances. But learning can also create some problems too. The overjustification effect says that people who may be motivated to grow as an individual, if they receive some sort of reward for that action that might help them grow as an individual, they're going to only keep doing it to seek out that reward, and less and less and less each time they're going to be seeking it out to help with their own personal growth. Finally, we get to Edward Tolman. Edward Tolman carried out an experiment in which he put a series of rats in a maze, and what he found was he let them just kind of wander the maze for a long time, and then he put food at the end of the maze, and he put the rats back at the start. And what he found is those rats were able to go straight through the maze without any mistakes, and they were able to get to the food. Now, how did this work? Well, the rats, through by that simple navigation of the maze as they were just exploring it, developed what we would call a cognitive map, which is an internal visual of a physical space. So think that if you ever gotten up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and if you have to navigate your house in the dark, and you're able to do that, it's because you've developed a cognitive map. Additionally, what he found was also examples of latent learning, where with latent learning, the rats were learning something before and then demonstrating it later. And that's what latent learning is, when you learn something prior and then demonstrate it later. So cognitive maps and latent learning tend to go together. Not all latent learning has to do with cognitive maps. We certainly learn things previously in our lives and then demonstrate them later on. But when we have a cognitive map, it is literally a perfect example of latent learning, because we had to learn that physical space first before we can develop that mental image of it in our mind. And that is the end of the lecture.